Have you ever wondered what would happen if the person who promised to stand beside you for the rest of your life slowly convinced everyone that you couldn't be trusted? Not because you'd done something wrong, but because they claimed you were losing your mind? Most people fear getting older. I never did. I accepted the gray hair, the aching knees, and the reading glasses that somehow always disappeared when I needed them. But there was one fear I never saw coming. Waking up one day to discover that your own family no longer believes you. Tell me, if your wife looked your children in the eye and quietly said, "Your father has dementia," would they ask you if it was true? Or would they believe her? My name is Richard Lawson. I'm 72 years old, and until last spring, I thought I'd lived a pretty ordinary life. 46 years of marriage, 2 grown children, 3 grandchildren who could still make me smile on my worst days. I spent more than 4 decades working with my hands, building a life that wasn't glamorous but was honest. I believed honesty counted for something. I believed that after a lifetime of keeping my word, people would know my character well enough to recognize a lie when they heard one. I was wrong. At first, the changes were so small, I barely noticed them. Carol, my wife, would laugh gently when I forgot where I'd left my glasses. "You're getting forgetful," she'd tease. I'd laugh too. That's what 72 looks like. It seemed harmless. And she started saying the same thing to other people. "Richard's been forgetting little things lately." She always smiled when she said it, almost as if she were embarrassed to bring it up. Looking back, that smile was part of the performance. It made her sound caring instead of calculating. A few weeks later, I noticed something strange. Friends I'd known for years began asking me unusual questions. "Everything all right, Richard? You feeling okay these days? You remembering to take it easy?" None of them sounded accusing. If anything, they sounded concerned. But I couldn't understand why they were suddenly treating me differently. Then one afternoon, I walked into the living room just as Carol was ending a phone call. She didn't realize I'd heard the last sentence. "I just don't know how much longer he'll be able to manage on his own." She turned, saw me standing there, and smiled as though nothing had happened. That was the moment I realized something had changed. I just didn't know how far the lie had already spread. I wanted to believe I'd misunderstood what I'd heard. After 46 years of marriage, your mind looks for innocent explanations before it accepts painful ones. Maybe she was talking about someone else. Maybe she'd simply chosen her words poorly. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. But once a seed of doubt is planted, you start noticing things that never seemed important before. The following Sunday, after church, people who normally chatted with me for 20 minutes suddenly kept their conversations short. One neighbor put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Take care of yourself, Richard." Another gave Carol a sympathetic smile before walking away. It felt as though everyone knew something, except me. On the drive home, I finally asked, "Have you been telling people I'm not well?" Carol didn't even look surprised. "They're just worried about you." "Worried about what?" She kept her eyes on the road for a few seconds before answering. "I've mentioned you've been a little forgetful. That's all. A little forgetful?" I repeated. "Carol, everyone our age forgets things now and then." "I know," she said softly. "I was only trying to prepare them." Prepare them. Those 2 words stayed with me for the rest of the day. Prepare them for what? That evening, our daughter, Melissa, called. After asking how I was doing, she hesitated before saying, "Dad, Mom told me you've been having some memory problems. Is everything okay?" My heart sank. There it was. Not a rumor. Not a misunderstanding. The story had reached my own children. I answered calmly, "Melissa, I'm fine." She sounded relieved, but not completely convinced. After we hung up, I sat alone on the back porch for nearly an hour, watching the sun disappear behind the trees. I kept asking myself the same question. Why? Why would the woman I'd trusted for nearly half a century tell people I had dementia when she knew it wasn't true? I didn't have an answer, but I made one decision before I went to bed that night. I wouldn't confront Carol. Not yet. If she was willing to tell a lie this serious, arguing with her wouldn't make it disappear. It would only warn her that I was paying attention. So I smiled. I listened, and I pretended I hadn't noticed a thing. Because somewhere beneath that lie was a reason, and I was determined to uncover it, even if that meant letting everyone believe I was the one who'd stopped seeing the truth. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I started paying attention instead of simply living my life. It's amazing what you notice when you stop assuming the people around you are telling the truth. For 46 years, Carol had been my partner. I never questioned why she answered the phone first or why she insisted on organizing our paperwork. We had always divided responsibilities, and I trusted her completely. Now, that same trust felt like a blindfold. Over the next week, I began seeing little things that had never stood out before. Whenever we were with other people, Carol found a way to mention my memory. It wasn't obvious. She was too smart for that. If someone asked whether we'd be joining friends for dinner on Friday, she'd laugh lightly and say, "Let me check Richard's calendar. He's been mixing up dates lately." If I paused for a moment before answering a question, she'd quickly finish my sentence. That's what he meant. She always sounded patient, kind, supportive. To anyone listening, she looked like a devoted wife helping her aging husband. To me, it started feeling like I was slowly disappearing while standing right beside her. The worst part wasn't what she said. It was how naturally everyone accepted it. Nobody questioned her. Nobody looked at me and asked if it was true. People simply nodded, as though they were watching something sad unfold and didn't want to embarrass me by talking about it. I found myself testing people without meaning to. One afternoon, our son David stopped by the house. We were talking about a baseball game we'd watched together a few weeks earlier. Halfway through the conversation, I intentionally mentioned the wrong final score. David smiled politely. "Actually, Dad, I think you've got that mixed up." Before I could answer, Carol spoke from the kitchen. "See what I mean? He's been doing that a lot lately." David didn't argue. He just looked at me with concern. That look hurt more than any words ever could. Not because my son wanted to help me, but because someone had quietly taught him not to trust his own father. As David drove away, I stood in the driveway, waving until his truck disappeared around the corner. Then I turned back toward the house. For the first time in my marriage, I looked at my wife not as my partner, but as someone I no longer understood. That night, sleep refused to come. Carol was lying beside me, breathing as peacefully as she always did, while I stared at the ceiling, replaying every conversation from the past few months. The more I thought about it, the more one question refused to leave me alone. What did she have to gain? People don't tell lies this elaborate for no reason. There had to be an endgame. The following Tuesday, Carol told me she was meeting a friend for lunch. She left just after 11, kissed me on the cheek as if everything were perfectly normal, and reminded me not to forget the leftovers in the refrigerator. "I wouldn't want them to spoil," she said with a warm smile. As soon as her car disappeared down the street, I made myself another cup of coffee and sat quietly at the kitchen table. I wasn't looking for evidence. Not yet. I was looking for patterns. I pulled out the family calendar and noticed something odd. Over the past 2 months, Carol had attended several appointments she had never mentioned to me. Some were simply marked 10:30 or 2 o'clock with no explanation. Others were labeled only with initials I didn't recognize. Carol had never kept secrets from me before. At least, that's what I'd always believed. Then another memory surfaced. About 3 weeks earlier, she'd insisted on taking over all of our monthly bills. "You've handled them for decades," she'd said. "Let me make life a little easier for you." At the time, I'd thanked her. Now, those words sounded different. Not generous. Strategic. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger makes people reckless. What I felt was something colder, a quiet determination to understand exactly what was happening before making a single move. If Carol was building a story about me, I needed facts, not emotions. I needed patience. Most of all, I needed to stop thinking like a husband and start thinking like someone solving a puzzle. Because one thing had become painfully clear. This wasn't a few careless comments that had gotten out of hand. It was a carefully planted narrative. And every day, I stayed silent. Carol seemed to grow more confident that I would never see through it. She had no idea that the man she believed was losing his memory had just started paying closer attention than ever before. What I still didn't know was that, before the week was over, I would stumble across something that transformed my suspicion into certainty and left me questioning whether my wife had been planning this for months or for years. The strange thing about suspicion is that once it takes hold, your mind starts connecting pieces you never thought belonged together. I kept reminding myself, not to let imagination replace evidence. If Carol was lying, I needed proof, not hunches. I'd spent my entire career making decisions based on facts, and I wasn't about to abandon that principle now. 2 days later, I got my first real clue. It happened by pure accident. Carol had gone grocery shopping, and I was looking for the warranty booklet for our washing machine. It had started making a rattling noise, and I remembered keeping all our appliance manuals in the small filing cabinet in the study. When I opened the drawer, everything looked normal at first. Utility bills, insurance papers, tax returns. Then I noticed a plain manila folder tucked behind a stack of old bank statements. It wasn't labeled. That alone caught my attention. Carol labeled everything. I pulled it out, expecting medical receipts or maybe information about one of the grandchildren's school activities. Instead, I found several printed pages clipped neatly together. The first page wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Carol. I didn't read every word immediately. My eyes locked onto a single phrase near the middle of the page. Capacity concerns. A few lines lower. Decision-making ability. My pulse quickened. The document wasn't saying I had dementia. It was discussing what would happen if someone believed I no longer had the capacity to manage my own affairs. I read those paragraphs 3 times. There was nothing with my name on the first page, but it didn't matter. I knew enough to understand the direction it was pointing. This wasn't a random internet article. It wasn't something clipped from a newspaper. It looked like information someone had specifically requested. I carefully placed every sheet back into the folder exactly as I found it. Then I closed the filing cabinet. For several minutes, I just stood there in silence. I wasn't frightened anymore. I was alert, because whatever Carol was planning, she'd already started preparing for it long before I realized there was even a problem. And if she was gathering information, I needed to start gathering some of my own. That afternoon, I didn't mention the folder. When Carol came home carrying grocery bags, I met her at the door like I always had. I took the heavier bags from her hands, thanked her for picking up my favorite coffee, and asked how lunch with her friend had gone. She smiled so naturally that, for a brief moment, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined everything. Quiet, she said. We mostly talked about the grandkids. I nodded and smiled back. If she'd lied to my face before, she'd have no trouble doing it again. Over the next few days, I made a habit of saying very little. I listened far more than I spoke. It was remarkable how much people revealed when they believed you weren't paying attention. Carol continued telling the same story, only now it had grown a little stronger. Richard gets confused sometimes. He's repeating himself more than he used to. I just worry about him. Every version sounded rehearsed. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just believable enough to spread from one person to another without raising suspicion. Then something happened that finally answered one question, while creating an even bigger one. Our daughter, Melissa, stopped by unexpectedly one Saturday afternoon. After we talked for a while, she hesitated before asking, "Dad, have you thought about letting Mom handle more of the financial decisions?" The question seemed casual. It wasn't. I smiled. Why would I do that? She looked uncomfortable. I don't know. Mom just said it might take some pressure off you. Pressure. That wasn't my word. It was Carol's. I realized then that she wasn't only changing how people saw me. She was quietly planning ideas. Ideas that would seem perfectly reasonable by the time someone suggested making them official. I answered as calmly as I could. I appreciate the concern, sweetheart, but I'm managing just fine. Melissa nodded, though I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. When she left, I remained standing at the front window until her car disappeared down the street. My heart wasn't broken because my daughter had asked the question. It was broken because she'd believed someone else before believing the father who had spent her entire life protecting her. That evening, I sat alone on the back porch with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. For days, I've been asking myself why Carol was doing this. Now, another question had taken its place. Who else already knew? Because lies this carefully constructed don't spread on their own. Someone was helping her, and I had a feeling I was much closer to discovering who it was than they ever expected. The following Monday, I decided it was time to stop reacting and start observing with purpose. For years, I believed that trust meant never questioning the people you loved. Now, I realize trust without awareness is simply vulnerability. If Carol was building a case against me, every careless move I made could become another piece of her story. So I changed my routine. Not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for me to notice them. I began carrying a small pocket notebook wherever I went. It wasn't because I needed help remembering. It was because I wanted an accurate record of conversations, dates, and little incidents that might seem meaningless today, but important tomorrow. If Carol mentioned something unusual, I wrote it down after she left the room. If someone repeated a rumor about my memory, I noted who said it and when. For the first time in my life, I was documenting my own marriage. One Wednesday afternoon, Carol told me she was meeting our daughter for coffee. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was Melissa's reaction later that evening when she called. "Thanks for understanding today, Dad." I frowned. Understanding what? There was a brief silence. About Mom explaining everything. My grip tightened on the phone. "No, sweetheart," I said as calmly as I could. "I don't know what you're talking about." Melissa hesitated. I thought she'd already discussed it with you." "Discussed what?" Another long pause. Then she quietly changed the subject. We talked about the grandchildren for a few more minutes before ending the call. But my mind never left those words. Mom explaining everything. Everything? What exactly had Carol explained? Whatever it was, my own daughter believed I'd already agreed with it. That meant Carol wasn't just sharing concerns anymore. She was speaking on my behalf. She was telling people what I supposedly thought, what I supposedly wanted, perhaps even what I supposedly couldn't understand anymore. For the first time since all of this began, I felt something more powerful than confusion. I felt urgency, because if other decisions were already being discussed without me, I might be running out of time. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my son first, not because I wanted to accuse anyone, because I wanted to listen. "Morning, Dad," David answered cheerfully. We talked about ordinary things for a few minutes, the weather, his work, my grandson's baseball season. Then I casually asked, "Has your mother mentioned anything about me lately?" There was a pause. "Why do you ask?" "I was just curious." David let out a slow breath. "Mom's been worried." There it is again, I thought. Worried. Always the same word. Never frightened. Never panicked. Just worried. It sounded caring enough that no one questioned it. "What exactly is she worried about?" I asked. He hesitated, clearly choosing his words. "She says you've been forgetting bills, repeating stories, getting confused with paperwork." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because I had paid every bill in this family for more than 40 years. I balanced our accounts every month, filed our taxes on time, and could still tell you the serial number of the first pickup truck I ever bought. Yet somehow, the man who had always managed the family's finances was now supposedly incapable of remembering them. "I appreciate you telling me," I said calmly. We only want what's best for you, Dad." "I know," and I believed he meant it. That was the tragedy. David wasn't trying to betray me. He genuinely thought he was protecting his father. The betrayal belonged to the person who had given him a false picture to believe. After he hung up, I opened my notebook and wrote down every detail of the conversation. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Carol wasn't inventing dramatic stories. She was repeating the same carefully crafted narrative to everyone. Each person received just enough information to reach the same conclusion on their own. It was subtle, methodical, almost impossible to challenge without sounding defensive. And then a memory surfaced that made my stomach tighten. About 2 months earlier, Carol had insisted we update our wills. At the time, she'd said, "It's just good planning. We're not getting any younger." I hadn't thought twice about it. Now, I wondered if that conversation had never really been about planning for the future. Maybe it had been the first move in a game I didn't even know we were playing. I looked out the kitchen window as Carol's car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out smiling, carrying a small shopping bag as though it had been the most ordinary day in the world. I smiled back, but for the first time, I wasn't looking at my wife. I was looking at someone whose next move I needed to predict before she made it. Because deep down, I had the unsettling feeling that whatever she'd planned, it was about to move far beyond whispered conversations. Over the next several days, I stopped asking questions. Questions warn people that you're getting close to the truth. Instead, I watched. I listened. And I waited. It didn't take long before Carol gave me another piece of the puzzle. One Thursday morning, while we were having breakfast, she slid a white envelope across the table. "I think it's time we started simplifying a few things," she said, stirring her coffee without looking at me. I glanced at the envelope but didn't open it. "What kind of things?" "Oh, nothing major," she replied with a reassuring smile. "Just a few forms. It would make life easier if I could handle certain financial matters for you." There was again. For you. Everything she suggested sounded like it was for my benefit. She never mentioned herself, never mentioned control, never mentioned authority, only convenience. I opened the envelope. Inside were several neatly printed documents. At first glance, they looked routine, but as I read more carefully, one phrase caught my attention. Financial power of attorney. I looked up at Carol. "When did you decide we needed this?" She didn't hesitate. "I've been thinking about it for a while." "For a while?" She nodded. "I just worry that if something ever happened unexpectedly, the kids and I would have a difficult time helping you." Helping me. Another carefully chosen phrase. I folded the papers, slipped them back into the envelope, and laid it on the table. "I'll read through these later." For the first time since this all began, I noticed the smallest flicker of disappointment cross Carol's face. It disappeared almost instantly. "Of course," she said warmly. "Take your time." But I had the distinct feeling she'd expected me to sign them without reading a single page. That afternoon, I drove to the park instead of running my usual errands. I sat on a quiet bench overlooking the lake, the envelope resting beside me. The ducks drifted peacefully across the water, completely unaware of how quickly a calm surface can hide dangerous currents. I finally admitted something to myself that I'd been avoiding for weeks. This was no longer about rumors. It was no longer about whispered conversations. Carol wanted something in writing, something official. And if I made one careless decision, I might hand her exactly what she'd been working toward all along. What I didn't know was that those papers were only the beginning. Within 48 hours, I would discover a meeting had already taken place, a meeting I was never supposed to know about. I didn't sign the papers. I didn't refuse them, either. I simply left the envelope on the corner of my desk, exactly where Carol could see it every time she walked past. Every evening she'd glance at it without saying a word, as if she were waiting for me to make the decision she had already made in her own mind. 3 days passed. Then something happened that I couldn't dismiss as coincidence. On Saturday morning, Carol told me she was going shopping with Melissa. "They're having a sale at the home store," she said. "We'll probably be gone a couple of hours." I smiled. "Enjoy yourselves." The moment they left, I decided to organize the garage. About 20 minutes later, I realized I'd left a box of old extension cords in the basement storage room. As I walked downstairs, I noticed the small family printer was still on. That wasn't unusual. What caught my attention was a single sheet of paper sitting face down in the output tray. I almost ignored it. Almost. I picked it up. It wasn't addressed to me. At the top of the page were the words, "Meeting confirmation." Below there was a date. 2 days earlier. I read the first paragraph once. Then again, more slowly. It thanked Carol for meeting to discuss future planning and referenced additional documents that would be reviewed at the next appointment. There was no mention of dementia. No mention of me by name. But there didn't have to be. The timing, the paperwork, the conversations, it all pointed in the same direction. Someone was advising Carol. Someone knew far more than I did. I carefully placed the paper back exactly as I found it. When Carol and Melissa returned later that afternoon, I acted no differently than usual. We unloaded shopping bags, joked about the ridiculous price of coffee makers, and ordered pizza for dinner. Carol laughed. Melissa laughed. I laughed too. But for the first time in my life, I realized I was sitting at my own dining table surrounded by people who didn't know I'd started seeing the cracks in the story. That night, I opened my notebook and added one more entry. Meeting confirmed. She's getting professional advice. Don't react. Keep watching. Then I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair. The temptation to confront Carol was stronger than ever. But confrontation would only answer the questions I already had. Patience. Patience might answer the ones I didn't. And something told me those unanswered questions were the ones that would matter most when the truth finally came to light. The hardest part wasn't pretending everything was normal. The hardest part was pretending with the person who had shared nearly half my life. Every morning, Carol poured my coffee just the way she always had. Every evening, we'd sit in the living room watching the news, commenting on politics, the weather, or whatever ballgame happened to be on television. If someone had looked through our front window, they would have seen an ordinary retired couple enjoying a quiet life. They never would have guessed that every conversation had become a test. One Tuesday afternoon, Carol walked into the den carrying a small stack of mail. "There are a few things that need your signature," she said casually. I looked up from the book I was reading. "What kind of things?" "Oh, just routine paperwork." Routine. Another word she seemed to use a lot lately. I took the papers and slowly flipped through them. Most were harmless. Insurance updates, a utility notice, a charity mailing. Mixed in between them was a single authorization form giving Carol permission to speak on my behalf regarding one of our financial accounts. It was subtle, easy to miss if someone signed without reading. I looked up and smiled. "I'll go through these after dinner." For the briefest moment, I saw something flash across her face. Not anger, impatience. It disappeared almost instantly. "No rush," she said. But I could tell there was a rush, just not one she wanted me to know about. That evening, after Carol went to bed, I spread every document across the dining room table. I read each page carefully, line by line. The authorization form wasn't dangerous by itself. In fact, there were perfectly legitimate reasons for a married couple to have one. But after everything I'd seen over the past several weeks, it no longer felt like an isolated document. It felt like another brick being added to the same wall, a wall that was slowly closing around me. I placed the papers back into their envelopes exactly as I found them. Then I wrote a single sentence in my notebook. "Never sign anything simply because someone says it's routine." I closed the notebook and looked around the quiet house. For years, this place had been my refuge. Now it felt as though I was living inside a story where I was the only person who hadn't been given the full script. And I had a growing suspicion the next chapter was about to reveal who else had been reading from it all along. 2 days later, I got the answer in the most ordinary way imaginable. It wasn't through a hidden letter. It wasn't through a dramatic confrontation. It was a simple phone call. Carol was outside, trimming the rose bushes when the house phone rang. She had left her cell phone charging in the kitchen, so I answered without thinking. "Hello." There was a brief pause. "Good afternoon," a woman's voice said. "May I speak with Carol Lawson?" "She's outside at the moment." "May I ask who's calling?" Another short silence. "This is Susan. We had an appointment with Mrs. Lawson last week, and I'm calling to confirm Tuesday at 10. Appointment. The word immediately caught my attention. "Would you like me to take a message?" "Yes. Please let her know we have all the documents prepared for review." Documents. Again, before I could ask another question, she thanked me politely and ended the call. I wrote the date and time on the notepad beside the phone, exactly as she'd requested. When Carol came back inside, I handed her the note. She glanced at it for less than a second before folding it into her pocket. "Oh," she said casually, "I almost forgot about that." She didn't explain who Susan was. She didn't explain what the documents were. She simply changed the subject. "I think I'll make us some lemonade." I watched her walk into the kitchen. For the first time since this began, I noticed something I'd overlooked before. Carol had stopped offering explanations because she assumed I no longer questioned anything. That assumption was becoming her greatest weakness. The following Tuesday morning, she left the house just before 9:30. "I'll only be gone an hour or so," she said. "Drive safely," I replied, as her car disappeared down the street. I sat quietly in my recliner, listening to the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. I wasn't tempted to follow her. I wasn't interested in dramatic discoveries. What I needed now wasn't another suspicion. It was certainty, because certainty changes everything. Without it, you're just an old man accusing his wife of something no one else can see. With it, the truth has a way of speaking for itself. I looked down at the notebook that had become my silent companion over the past several weeks. Its pages were filling with dates, conversations, and observations. Individually, they meant very little. Together, they were beginning to tell a story. A story Carol believed only she understood. She was wrong. Because before long, I was about to uncover the one piece she'd never planned for me to find. And once I did, there would be no turning back for either of us. The answer came from someone who had no idea they were changing my life. 3 days after Carol's appointment, I was sorting through the afternoon mail when my phone rang. The caller ID showed the name of my longtime physician's office. I almost let go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. Richard Lawson speaking. Good afternoon, Mr. Lawson, the receptionist said. I'm just calling to confirm your cognitive assessment next Thursday at 2 o'clock. For a moment, I thought she dialed the wrong number. My what? Your cognitive assessment, she repeated politely. Dr. Harris asked us to reserve extra time for the appointment. I sat perfectly still. I'm sorry, I said. I don't remember scheduling anything like that. There was a pause on the other end. Oh, the receptionist sounded confused. Our records show the appointment was requested last week. Requested by whom? Another brief silence. I'm sorry, sir. I probably shouldn't discuss that over the phone. Understand? I replied, keeping my voice calm. Could you at least tell me whether I made the appointment myself? She hesitated. No, sir. That was all I needed to hear. After we ended the call, I remained seated at the kitchen table for several minutes, staring out the window. A cognitive assessment. Someone had tried to arrange an evaluation of my mental capacity, without even telling me. Suddenly, the rumors, the conversations, the paperwork, the meetings, they all seemed to point toward the same destination. I still didn't know exactly what Carol intended to do, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't simply preparing for a future that might come one day. She was actively trying to create one. When Carol returned home that evening, she found me exactly where she'd left me that morning, reading the newspaper in my favorite chair. You've been quiet today, she said. Just enjoying the peace. She smiled. I'm glad. I smiled back. Neither of us mentioned the phone call. Neither of us acknowledged that the ground beneath our marriage had shifted once again. But as she walked into the kitchen, I realized something that filled me with an unexpected sense of calm. For weeks, I'd been reacting to Carol's moves. Now, for the first time, I was finally one step ahead. The next morning, I kept the appointment. Not because I wanted to prove anything to Carol, because I wanted to know the truth about my own health. If there was even the slightest chance something was wrong, I wanted to hear it from my doctor, not through whispers that had passed from one person to another. When I arrived at Dr. Harris's office, the receptionist greeted me with a warm smile. Good morning, Mr. Lawson. The doctor will see you shortly. A few minutes later, Dr. Harris walked in, shook my hand, and sat across from me. It's good to see you, Richard. You too, doctor. He studied my face for a moment before asking, How have you been feeling? Fine. Any concerns about your memory? I smiled. The only concern I have is why everyone suddenly thinks I should have concerns. He leaned back in his chair. What makes you say that? So I told him, not everything, just enough. I explained that friends had begun treating me differently, that my children had started questioning my decisions, that my wife had been telling people she was worried about my memory. Dr. Harris listened without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands together. Richard, he said gently, I've been your physician for nearly 15 years. I nodded. If I'd seen any signs that made me genuinely concerned about your cognitive health, I would have discussed them with you directly. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. So, you haven't? He shook his head. No. The room fell silent. Then he added something I wasn't expecting. That doesn't mean we shouldn't complete today's assessment. It gives us a clear medical record of where things stand today. For the first time in weeks, that suggestion didn't frighten me. It made perfect sense. If the truth was on my side, I wanted it documented. The assessment took nearly an hour. Questions, memory exercises, problem-solving tasks, simple conversations designed to evaluate how my mind was working. When it was over, Dr. Harris smiled. You did very well. Well enough to stop worrying. He chuckled. I'd say well enough to keep enjoying retirement. As I walked back to my truck, the afternoon sun felt warmer than it had in weeks. I wasn't celebrating. Not yet. But I was carrying something far more valuable than reassurance. I was carrying an independent medical evaluation. And somehow, deep inside, I knew that piece of paper would become far more important than either Carol or I realized. Because whatever she had planned, it was becoming harder and harder for her story to survive the truth. I didn't tell Carol about the appointment, not because I wanted to deceive her, because I wanted to see what she would do if she believed I still knew nothing. When I got home, I placed the doctor's report in a folder inside my desk and locked it away. Then I went about the rest of the day as though nothing unusual had happened. We had dinner together, watched the evening news, and talked about our grandson's upcoming baseball tournament. Carol seemed relaxed, more relaxed than she'd been in weeks. That told me something. She believed her plan was still moving exactly as she'd intended. A few days later, Melissa called. "Dad, are you free for lunch tomorrow?" Of course. She suggested a small diner we'd been visiting ever since she was a little girl. When I arrived, she was already there, nervously stirring a cup of coffee. We talked about the grandchildren for a while before she finally looked at me and said, "Dad, can I ask you something?" "You can ask me anything." She hesitated. "Have you thought any more about letting Mom help with your finances?" There was again, not an accusation, not even a demand, just another gentle suggestion. I smiled. "You seem awfully interested in my finances lately." Her face flushed. "It's not me. I didn't think it was." She looked down at the table. "Mom says she's only trying to make sure everything's taken care of before things get worse." "Worse?" She nodded almost imperceptibly. I let the silence hang between us for several seconds. Then I asked the question that had been on my mind for weeks. "Melissa, has your mother ever actually told you that a doctor says I have dementia?" She blinked. "No." "Has she ever shown you a medical report?" She slowly shook her head. "No." "Then what exactly has she shown you?" Melissa looked genuinely confused. I guess nothing." For the first time since all of this began, I saw doubt appear on my daughter's face. Not doubt about me, doubt about the story she'd been hearing. As we finished lunch, she hugged me a little tighter than usual. "I love you, Dad. I love you too, sweetheart." As I watched her walk to her car, I realized something important. Carol's greatest strength had always been getting people to make assumptions. The moment those assumptions were questioned, the cracks began to spread. Melissa's questions stayed with me long after lunch was over. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Hope. Not because everything had suddenly become clear, because I'd finally seen that the people around me weren't malicious. They'd simply been given one version of the story, and they'd trusted the person telling it. That evening, something unexpected happened. Melissa called again. Her voice was quieter than usual. "Dad, can I ask you one more thing?" "Of course." "Have you ever forgotten who I am?" The question hit me harder than I expected. I closed my eyes for a moment before answering. "Never." "And have you ever gotten lost driving home?" "No." "Or forgotten to pay your bills?" I smiled sadly. "I've been paying bills since before you were born." There was silence on the line. Then I heard her take a slow breath. "I don't know what to think anymore." "You don't have to decide today," I said gently. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "Don't believe anything about me, good or bad, without seeing it for yourself." She didn't answer immediately. Finally, she whispered, "I promise." After we hung up, I sat in my recliner, staring at the family photographs on the mantel. Melissa at her high school graduation, David on his wedding day, Carol and me smiling on our 40th anniversary cruise. I wondered how many of those smiles had been genuine. The thought hurt more than I cared to admit. Later that night, Carol came into the living room, carrying 2 cups of tea. She handed one to me. "You've seemed happier lately," she observed. "Have I?" "I think so." I smiled. "Maybe I've just been appreciating life a little more." She returned the smile, but there was something different about her expression. It wasn't confidence anymore. It was curiosity, almost as if she sensed that something had changed, but couldn't quite figure out what. That was the first moment I realized the balance between us had begun to shift. For weeks, I've been trying to understand Carol's plan. Now, she seemed to be wondering whether I had a plan of my own. She was right to wonder, because earlier that afternoon, my doctor's office had called. My complete evaluation was ready, and the written conclusion at the bottom of the report was stronger than I had dared hope. It wasn't just good news. It was the kind of evidence that could dismantle months of whispered lies. if I used it at exactly the right moment. The only question left was whether that moment had finally arrived, or whether patience would win me something even greater than simply proving I was right. I picked up the medical report the following morning. Dr. Harris greeted me with the same calm smile he'd worn for years. "I thought you might want an extra copy for your records," he said, sliding a sealed envelope across his desk. "Thank you." He paused for a moment before adding, "Richard, I don't usually give personal advice outside of medicine." I looked up. "But if people are making decisions about your future based on assumptions rather than facts, don't wait too long to protect yourself." I nodded. "I won't." On the drive home, I pulled into a quiet park and opened the envelope. The report was clear. There was no confusing language, no uncertain conclusions. My cognitive abilities were normal for my age. There was no medical basis for anyone to claim I was incapable of managing my own affairs. I read those words twice. Then I carefully folded the report and placed it back into the envelope. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I wasn't carrying hope. I was carrying proof. That evening, Carol surprised me. "We need to talk," she said after dinner. Her tone was unusually serious. I set my coffee cup down. "All right." She sat across from me at the kitchen table and folded her hands together. "I've been thinking about our future. So have I. I believe it's time we started making some important decisions." I didn't interrupt. "The children are worried." "I know. They've noticed you've been struggling." I looked directly into her eyes. "Have they?" She nodded slowly. "I think we'd all feel better if you let me start handling more of the financial responsibilities." There was not a request. Not really. A carefully prepared step. Months of quiet conversations had led to this single moment. I could almost hear every whispered comment echoing behind her words. "He's forgetting things. He's getting confused. He's not the man he used to be." I reached for the envelope she'd given me weeks earlier, the one containing the power of attorney documents. It was still exactly where I'd left it. Carol watched me closely. For the first time since all of this started, she looked hopeful, as though she believed victory was finally within reach. She had no idea the envelope I intended to open wasn't hers. I let my hand rest on Carol's envelope for a moment. Then I quietly slid it aside. "I agree," I said. Her eyes lit up. "I think it's time we dealt with paperwork." She smiled with visible relief. "I knew you'd see it that way." I stood up from the table. "Give me just a minute." Walking to my study, I opened the top drawer of my desk and removed the folder I'd hidden weeks earlier. Inside was the cognitive assessment from Dr. Harris, neatly filed alongside every note I'd written since the day I first realized something was wrong. Dates, conversations, questions people had asked me, comments Carol had made in front of friends and family. I hadn't collected them because I wanted revenge. I collected them because I knew memories can be challenged. Written facts are much harder to dismiss. When I returned to the kitchen, Carol was still sitting exactly where I'd left her. I placed my folder on the table. "I think we should read these before I sign anything." Her smile faded ever so slightly. "What are they?" "My medical records." She blinked. "You went to the doctor?" "I did." "When?" "A few weeks ago." The room became very still. "I thought it was only fair to find out whether everything you've been telling people was actually true." Carol's expression changed from surprise to something I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't guilt. Not yet. It was calculation. She was trying to decide how much I knew. She reached toward the folder. "May I?" "Of course." She opened it slowly. The first page contained Dr. Harris's evaluation. The conclusion was impossible to misunderstand. No evidence of cognitive impairment. Fully capable of managing personal and financial affairs. She stared at those words without speaking. Finally, she looked up. "Medical tests aren't always perfect." I held her gaze. "No," I replied calmly, "but they're far more reliable than rumors." For the first time in weeks, Carol had no prepared response. No reassuring smile. No carefully chosen phrase about being worried. Only silence. And in that silence, I realized something important. The story she'd spent months building had begun to crack. But it hadn't collapsed. Not yet. Because I wasn't interested in winning an argument across the kitchen table. I was waiting for something much bigger. The court hearing she'd quietly been preparing for all along. And when that day arrived, I intended to let the truth speak where it mattered most. The court date arrived 6 weeks later. By then, I understood why Carol had never seemed nervous. She believed the story had already been decided long before anyone stepped into that courtroom. Friends had heard her concerns. Our children had watched her care for me. Neighbors had repeated the same whispers to one another. From the outside, she looked like a devoted wife trying to protect her aging husband. I looked like an old man who didn't realize he needed protecting. As I walked through the courthouse doors that morning, I felt strangely calm. Not because I knew exactly what would happen, because I'd finally stopped fearing the truth. The courtroom wasn't large. A handful of people sat quietly waiting for the hearing to begin. Carol was already there with her attorney. Melissa and David arrived a few minutes later. Both smiled nervously when they saw me. I smiled back. There was no anger in my heart toward them. They had believed the person they trusted most. I couldn't blame them for that. What mattered was what they would believe after today. When our case was called, everyone took their places. The judge greeted us politely and reviewed the purpose of the hearing. As expected, Carol's attorney spoke first. He described a husband whose memory had been declining for months. He spoke about concern, about safety, about protecting financial assets. Every sentence sounded reasonable. If I hadn't been living through it myself, I might have believed him too. When he finished, the judge turned toward me. "Mr. Lawson, would you like to respond?" I stood slowly, not because I was weak, because I wanted every movement to be deliberate. "Yes, Your Honor." The courtroom became completely silent. "I've listened carefully this morning," I began, and if I didn't know better, I'd think they were describing someone I've never met. A few people shifted in their seats. I continued calmly. "My wife has spent months telling people she's worried about my memory. She never once told them I'd already undergone a complete medical evaluation." I lifted the folder from the table. "I'd like the court to review these records." The bailiff carried the documents to the judge. For several long moments, no one spoke. The judge carefully read the first page, then the second, then looked up over his glasses. "Mr. Lawson," he said, "these evaluations appear to conclude that you're fully capable of managing your own affairs." "Yes, Your Honor." The judge slowly turned his attention toward Carol. And for the first time since all of this began, I saw genuine uncertainty on her face. Because the story she'd carefully constructed for months had finally met something it could not overcome. The truth. The judge didn't say another word for several seconds. He simply continued reading the medical report, then compared it with the documents that had been submitted on Carol's behalf. The silence in that courtroom felt louder than any argument ever could. Finally, he looked toward Carol. "Mrs. Lawson," he said evenly, "this evaluation was completed before today's hearing. Were you aware of it?" Carol hesitated. For the first time in nearly a year, she didn't have an immediate answer. "I wasn't aware of the final report," she said quietly. The judge nodded, but his expression didn't change. Then he turned back to me. "Mr. Lawson, is there anything else you'd like the court to know?" I took a slow breath. "Yes, Your Honor. I wasn't there to humiliate Carol. I wasn't there to punish my children. I was there to reclaim something far more valuable than money. My dignity." I explained how the rumors had started, how friends had begun treating me differently, how my own children had questioned my judgment because they believed they were helping their father. I never raised my voice. I never called Carol names. I simply described what had happened and let the facts speak for themselves. When I finished, I looked toward Melissa and David. Both of them had tears in their eyes. Melissa was the first to stand after the hearing ended. She walked straight to me and wrapped her arms around me. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she whispered. "I should have talked to you instead of talking about you." I hugged her tightly. "You were trying to do the right thing," I said. "You were just given the wrong story." David shook my hand before pulling me into a hug of his own. "I should have trusted you." "You trust people you love," I replied. "That's not a weakness. Just make sure next time you listen to both sides before deciding what's true." As for Carol, she walked out of the courtroom without saying a word. That was the last day we stood together as husband and wife. The months that followed weren't about revenge. They were about rebuilding a peaceful life, one based on honesty instead of suspicion. I downsized to a smaller home, spent more afternoons watching my grandkids play ball, and discovered that peace is worth far more than winning an argument. If there's one lesson this experience taught me, it's this. Growing older doesn't make you invisible. It doesn't erase your judgment, your wisdom, or your voice. The greatest danger isn't age itself. It's allowing someone else to convince the world that your voice no longer matters. Carol believed a lie repeated often enough would become the truth. She was wrong, because lies can travel fast. But the truth has something they never will. It lasts.